Okay, we're going to get started. I want to thank you all for coming today to our panel on Walls, Global Histories of Borders and Barriers. My name is Michelle King. I'm an associate professor in the UNC History Department, and with me today are my esteemed colleagues, also in the UNC History Department, and we wanted to share our thoughts and ideas about the current debate about the U.S.-Mexico border wall by giving you all a perspective, a global perspective on walls in history as borders and barriers. So, one of the things that is wonderful about the humanities and about history in particular is that it really gives us a sense of perspective. We can get kind of closed in our box and thinking about domestic issues and the domestic situation, but actually, as we're going to see, walls have been used many times in many places for a variety of purposes to a variety of effects. In fact, some not very effective effects, as we're also going to see. And I think it's just really helpful to shed light on current debates because it gives us a sense of what has worked in the past, what hasn't worked in the past. How can we bring our study of history into our contemporary debates, of which this is so on the front page news, it's pretty unavoidable. So what we're going to do today is each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes on their particular wall that they're interested in sharing with you. And I've asked our department chair, Lisa Lindsay, to be the timekeeper so that when she says stop, they will promptly stop at 10 minutes. And we'll save the remainder of the time period we have in this room for all of your questions and answers, because I know a lot of you will have questions and answers about the contemporary situation and also perhaps about the historical situation. So to briefly introduce each of our speakers, I've introduced myself. I am a specialist in late imperial and modern Chinese history. I'm just going to introduce your teaching field, essentially, because I think a lot of students here would be interested to know what you teach. Our next speaker will be Brett Whalen, and he's a specialist in medieval religious history, European medieval religious history. Our speaker after that will be Konrad Garausch, and he's a specialist in modern German history. And then Sarah Shields, who is our specialist in modern Middle Eastern history. And then finally, Cynthia Radding, who is a specialist in colonial Latin America. So all of us teach broadly on all of our areas in the globe. So without further ado, then, I'm going to start. I don't always get the precedence, but because I teach China, the history goes way, way back. So I get to start. And I should say a few more things before I start. The first is a thank you to both the UNC Department of History and to the Curriculum and Global Studies for sponsoring today's panel and providing the various expertise and funding in order to make this happen. And secondly, you all don't know it, but you're on camera. So this is being recorded right now, this presentation, so that we can share this with people beyond UNC. We're going to put it up, if all goes well. We're going to put it up on our departmental website so that a broader audience can also share in the expertise of our UNC historians. So if you're not okay with being filmed, you might want to sit far in the back or sit against the wall where the camera can't see you. Okay, so, all right, so I'm going to begin. The title of my talk is Walls and Border Security, China's Great Firewall. And on the way here, I was talking with my 7-year-old daughter, and I told her, Penelope, what do you know about the Great Wall? Thinking she'd tell me, oh, I saw it in Mulan or something like that. And she says, oh, Mom, I know all about the Great Wall. You don't have to tell me anything about it. Your class would be so boring for me. And I said, what do you know? She said, it's called the Great Wall of China. I said, okay, that's one thing you know. And she said, it's old and it's made of bricks. And I was like, okay, that's pretty good too. And those were her 2 factoids about the Great Wall. But I think one of the interesting things about the Great Wall is what a lot of space it kind of occupies in the world's kind of mind about walls. And that's why I feel like we have to begin this panel on walls with the Great Wall of China. It is the Ur Wall. It is the iconic wall of walls. Everyone references it. Everyone, if you think of China, they'll show this picture, and many kind of mythic ideas have been generated about China's Great Wall. One of them, this is from a book, kind of just a coffee table book about the Great Wall from 1984. It says, the most awesome structure ever devised by man, that lies across the northern borders of China like some great sleeping dragon, stretching and sunning itself on the peaks and ridges of some of the most beautiful mountain scenery in the world. An astonishing 6,000 kilometers long, the Great Wall of China was more than 2,000 years in the building, and the only way man can look upon the sum total of his handiwork is by viewing it from outer space. So those are three factoids that I think a lot of people have about the Great Wall. It's long. It's old. It took a long time to build. And finally, you can see it from space. We're going to talk about each of those ideas and kind of take them apart, brick by brick, if you will. The first lesson I want to share with you about the Great Wall is, yes, it is great, but it is not a wall. Okay, this is one of the first misconceptions that people have. It is not one single built entity, but in fact, it is a series of fortifications built in northern China over many, many, many centuries, starting in the 7th century BCE, right before the Common Era. So this does make it some of the earliest fortifications. But what is really interesting is that it has never been conceived of until very recently as one entity, right? Historical records refer to fortifications, refer to walls, but they don't necessarily refer to it as one kind of coherent entity. And you can see here from this map, the map is color-coded to all the different periods in which various parts of these fortifications in the north were built, beginning in the Warring States period in yellow, all the way up to the Ming Dynasty in dark purple. Right? So this is a really great map because it shows you it's not a wall. It's many different walls. More than that, you see a lot of breaks in these walls. Right? There's many different places and many different ways to go through those walls, right? Which is also very important. And so there never was a single wall snaking uninterrupted across a very long portion of China, as we like to imagine it to be, like a sleeping dragon or something like that, but always just a series of different fortifications. Okay, so that's one very important idea I want to break down about the wall. The Chinese kind of title of the wall is the 10,000 li long wall, 万里长城, it's called. And if you go to China today, you can go to its westernmost station, Jiayuguan, in the desert, or you can go to the easternmost part where it meets the sea, right, at Shanhaiguan here. And in between, you know, there's all these different states of disrepair that the wall might be in. If you go anywhere near Beijing and all the tourist sites, what you're seeing is a reconstruction, right, from the 1980s, 1990s, essentially post-reform era Chinese reconstruction of Ming Dynasty era walls. Okay, so this is the latest period. We'll talk about the Ming Dynasty in a second. But everything you see here is not, you know, bricks from 1,000 years ago, but they're bricks probably from the 1980s or 1990s or whatever. These are all reconstructions because many of those old things are in disrepair. You can see they're kind of falling apart or even in some places non-existent. We don't, because of all these different bits and pieces of the wall, we don't even actually know how long it was. How long is it, right? The idea of a 10,000 li long wall is really, Chinese like to use numbers a lot. They like hyperbole. So 10,000 li a long wall is just to say it's really long, right? And it's just like a hyperbolic statement of its great, great length. Okay, the next thing I want to share as a lesson is the idea that walls are not all about hardware. They're a lot about software. And essentially, the effectiveness of a wall is measured by its hardware, not its software. That is to say, it's the human people that work at the wall that are more important than the wall itself. Okay, and you can tell this because in the Ming, I don't know if you can all see that, but on the left, I have a map of China during the Ming Dynasty, and on the right is a map of China during the Qing Dynasty. The Ming is the second to last dynasty, and the Qing is the very last dynasty of China. And you can see in the Ming map, the wall actually does kind of border the northern edge of the Chinese Empire at the time. It's kind of a squiggly line. It might be a little bit hard for some of you to see it, but the wall does, in fact, border the northern edge of the Chinese Empire at the time. But by the time we get to the Qing, look at that squiggly line. It's the Chinese Empire on both sides of the wall. They didn't need the wall by the time the Qing came around because the Qing had taken over, you know, all of it. right? So it was kind of useless. So when we say that it's those walls are a reconstruction of the Ming Dynasty, this is why. Because the Ming were the last ones to actually need to use the wall for any defensive purposes, right? By the time we get to the Qing, you don't need that wall because they own both halves. Okay, so this is another part. Why are humans more important than the wall itself? Because your wall is only as good as your gatekeeper. Another lesson we can learn from the Ming is the fact that that when the Qing, basically at the time they were the Manchus coming from the north, this brown part is their homeland, right? They were conquering from the north, and they didn't have to fight a huge battle to get into China. There was no huge battle at the Great Wall where the defensive fortifications were used as they were supposed to be used. All they had to do was bribe the gatekeeper, right? So basically, this man, General Wu Sangui, Chinese history is very complicated, but in essence, another person took over or sort of overthrew the Ming Emperor, and Wu Sangui, who was stationed at Shanhaiguan, where the Great Wall meets the sea, was scared. He wrote to the Qing, at the time they weren't the Qing, but the Manchus for help, and basically was a turncoat. He let them in the gates. The gates were wide open for them when they came. So the wall is not effective without, human personnel to actually enforce it. Right? So that's another lesson that we can learn from the wall. Finally, I want to impart to you the idea that the Great Wall is important more because of its symbolic or mythic importance than its material reality. You could really say the same thing about the proposed U.S.-Mexico border wall, that its concept of a wall, build the wall, is much more important than what it actually might do or does do. Right, so I've got here, does anyone recognize this? Mulan. Mulan, yes. You want to reference China? You reference the Great Wall, the opening scene of Mulan, where they flare, the signal towers and all this stuff. Every 10-year-old kid knows this. And so I wanted to put that in there because he doesn't love Mulan. One of the things I wanted to share with you was this very, very well-known idea that you can see the Great Wall of China from the moon. That idea was first proposed by an English writer in 1754. Guess what? In 1754, they hadn't gone to the moon. How would they know if it was seen from the moon or not? They did not know. In this Ripley's Believe It or Not kind of cartoon, this was published in 1932. It's also it's inscribed on the bottom there that, this can be the only thing visible to the human eye from the moon. All right, so in 1932, they also had not gone to the moon. I also put their, somewhat exoticized or, racialized ideas about the Chinese, also a very interesting topic, but for another lecture. So, in fact, I want to dispel the myth. You cannot see the Great Wall of China from the moon unless you have super great vision, like 17,000 times better vision than 2020. Okay, the last thing, I'm sorry, I'm even going over my own time limit. The last thing I want to suggest to you is that China is building a new kind of wall, the Great Firewall of China. Again, it is symbolic in its importance, basically blocking out internet traffic from abroad. And this is perhaps a much more effective and dangerous kind of wall than the Great Wall ever was or will be. So I'm going to leave it there. You can ask me all questions about all this stuff I didn't get a chance to talk to, and I will turn it over next to Brett.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Hey, thanks for everybody for being here. You're to be commended on a beautiful spring day. So as Michelle mentioned, I work on medieval European history and teach medieval European history. And thank you very much. One of the things I'm constantly on the lookout for are references to the Middle Ages in contemporary political situations and in contexts. And this happens a lot. You'd be surprised, everybody, how much the Middle Ages are brought up. And to give you one example of that, just this last December or January, as some of these initial discussions started to ramp up ahead of the government shutdown about Trump's border wall, there was these references to it as being medieval. Some of you might have caught this. The first one I caught was a reference, a little more specifically, this was Jeff Merkley, an Oregon senator, talked about it as a 4th century strategy. That the building of a wall was a 4th century strategy. And this then went on, I found a 3rd century solution to a 21st century problem. Debates about the wall being medieval, being not medieval, Trump then actually himself in, I think it was an address from the Oval Office, referred to the wall as medieval. And in a way I couldn't 100% follow, suggested it was medieval because it actually worked. So immediately I wind up asking myself, why is the word medieval being used here? Every time somebody uses the word medieval or refers about a contemporary situation back to the Middle Ages, I want to ask, like, why, and sort of what are they trying to get you to feel, or what are they trying to get you to think about the situation? How are they trying to get you to reappraise what's going on in the contemporary moment by somehow describing it as medieval? Oh yeah, Steve Bannon on MSNBC called it a taxpayer financed medieval vanity project, which I thought was a particularly good one. So this reference to the 4th century, the first one I saw, particularly struck my attention. Because in my mind, that was not just about any old medieval wall, and I think part of this discussion has to do with the common association of castles with the Middle Ages and walls of the Middle Ages. But the 4th century reference, and to some extent the 3rd century, actually immediately got me to thinking about a specific wall at a specific time, which are the walls surrounding the frontiers of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, which, as I'll be describing in a few moments, does start to experience some really significant political changes along its frontiers in the late 4th century. So the 4th century reference was one that, in my mind, immediately got me to thinking about the Roman Empire. And by chance, when I was really starting to pick up on these storylines in late December, January, in January, I was teaching my Intro to Medieval History class. I think there's some people here from that class. And at that point, I was actually lecturing on this period of political transformation in the Roman world. And one of the reasons I was doing that is because in a traditional timeline, the Middle Ages start when the Roman Empire ends, to put it very, very crudely. So any good medievalist is going to start out their discussion of the Middle Ages with a discussion of, what happens to the Roman Empire. And I was lecturing on that very subject when all these discussions started to come up about Trump's border wall. And so we have a map here of the Roman Empire at height. I obviously don't have time in my 10 minutes to talk about the spread of the Roman Empire from the early stages of the Roman Republic, its development in Rome, through annexation, through conquest, through treaties and alliances. It spread around the Mediterranean world, and then eventually starting with Augustus, who's up here with some weird script on him talking. The first Roman emperor, the emergence of what becomes known as the Roman Empire, really embodied in this figure of the imperator, right? The emperor, the decider, the chief military figure of the supreme military figure of the Roman order. And that is what starts this tradition of the Roman Empire in the 1st century. And part of what you see by the 2nd, 3rd century, where you're seeing this map here showing the Roman Empire at its height in the late 2nd century, actually, is a vast empire that I think in our memory still is really understood as being civilized. I think it's understood as being very cosmopolitan, wealthy. Really, now, of course, there's a massive slave economy in this empire. There's a lot of violence and conquest which goes into the creation of this empire, and we should never forget that. But again, in the popular memory, I think there's an idea of ultimately this empire is just kind of a good thing, and something bad happens to it, right? And we need to understand what that bad thing is. And of course, to give you a hint of where I'm going with this, what happens is the walls don't work, right? You have these frontiers around the Roman world, and picking up on Michelle's point, I would very much describe them as kind of mythic, particularly along the Rhine here, and also along the Danube, but of course also across northern Africa and over here in the frontiers of the Sassanid Empire. You do have these frontiers. And let me be clear, they are militarized frontiers. There are walls. Hadrian's Wall being featured up here. There's a very famous one in northern England, but also in northern Africa and places like Tunisia over here. There are military outposts and encampments along these walls. So, certainly these are called the limes, right, in Latin, the Roman frontiers. And the idea, going back to our map here, is that those frontiers helped protect the empire and help keep the barbarians out. So that's the basic understanding of what's going on with these Roman frontiers. And again, this idea of them being mythic or being symbolic, I think looms large in these discussions. Because part of what's going on here is, again, if you look around or pay attention, you'll see constant references to the fall of the Roman Empire as having something to do with an object lesson of some kind for the condition of America in the late 20th or early 21st century. We could have a big debate about whether America is an empire or has an empire or not, but people do talk about American empire, and with America as the dominant global superpower, at least in the 90s, but still a superpower. In some sense, though, that empires fall, right? We know this because the Roman Empire fell. And somehow America needs to there's just maybe a lesson of that somehow, or a cautionary tale, or something we need to know so we don't fall. And this is just one. Are we witnessing the fall of the American Empire, right? This is just one example of this. You can find plenty of them. So whenever people start talking about the fall of Rome, I think they're also talking about contemporary America. And I think this whole discussion about the medieval 4th century walls is very much tapping into this. Now, I don't want to lie to you. There were crises along the frontiers of the Roman world. Certainly, above all, in the 3rd century, historians actually refer to this as the crisis of the 3rd century. There was civil war in the Roman world, something like 27 emperors in 40 years, or 47 emperors in 20 years. Lots of changeover in the leadership of the empire. There was a plague that broke out that seems to have devastated much of the Roman world. And importantly, for our discussion here, there was a series of incursions by barbarians, these people who were seen as being outside the empire, coming into the Roman Empire along the Rhine, the Danube, and also a really kind of devastating war, in fact, with the Sassanids in Persia. This is probably difficult to see in back, but this is a relief in Persia carved on a cliffside of the Roman Empire submitting himself to the Persian ruler because he had been defeated. Valerian had been defeated in battle. And he actually had his head chopped off and made into a drinking cup, supposedly, for the Persians. So things aren't going well for your empire when your emperor has his head cut off and it's made into a drinking cup. So there are problems along these frontiers. They're endangered. They're militarized. There's fighting that goes along them, particularly, say, in the 3rd century, certainly. The 3rd century crisis is basically brought to an end with this figure of Diocletian, a Roman emperor, starting in the late 280s. He carries out what's considered the Diocletian reforms, and by largely raising taxes and militarizing the empire. The Roman Empire starts to really become almost like an armed camp. You raise taxes, you pay for the army, and you militarize the empire to restore order and help stabilize these endangered frontiers. So there's a militarization of the empire here. And one consequence of that is that increasingly, people from the frontiers of the Roman Empire really start to be in the driver's seat of the political leadership of the Roman world. Generals, soldiers, figures from those more rough and tumble frontiers come to the fore. Barbara Rosenwein, who is a medievalist who's worked on these subjects, she talks about this as the provincializing of the Roman world, that the provinces, these frontier zones, are really starting to enter into the centrality of Roman political life, social life, even cultural and artistic life to a certain extent. And of course, the idea is the restored Roman Empire has a good run. After Diocletian, there's a good 70, 80 years of relative stability in the Roman imperial order. Critical era, by the way, for the spread of Christianity around the Roman world, which is something we don't have time to talk about today. But then starting in the late 4th century, 370s, 380s, you start to see a renewed pressures on the empire and disruptions on these frontiers along the Danube and along the Rhine. And of course, Edward Gibbon, this famous historian, describes this in a well-known book, multi-volume book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I imagine a lot of you have heard the expression or know about this book. It comes from Edward Gibbon's 18th century book. And you'll see here Gibbon's view. Notice the arrows. The arrows are bad, right? These are the barbarians smashing into the Roman Empire. And he talks about the Empire of Rome being firmly established by the perfect coalition of its members, right? The West was torn by the barbarians from the bosom of their mother country. Beyond the Rhine, and the Danube, the northern countries of Europe and Asia were filled with innumerable tribes of hunters and shepherds, poor, voracious, and turbulent, bold in arms, and impatient to ravage the fruits of industry. That's Gibbon's view, right, of the fall of the Roman Empire. The barbarians at the gate, coming in, the walls fail, and the empire falls. Right? Yeah. Let me quickly suggest a different view to you. And I'm just channeling Peter Brown here. One, as Brown talks about, you can equally view these frontiers as a complete hybrid place of contact and encounter. And that, in fact, this view of the fall of the Roman Empire is dramatically historically inaccurate. And we can talk about this in the Q&A. Brown, by contrast, talks about the fact that the contrast between Romans and barbarians that seems so clear to the imagination of contemporaries was constantly eroded by the facts of nature. He's writing in 2013, by the way. Like all great rivers, one thinks of the Rio Grande between Texas and Mexico. The Rhine and the Danube were as much joining places as they were dividing lines. All the barbarians in the frontier, they've been living there for generations, going back and forth across the walls. Those are hybrid zones of contact between the broader world and the Roman world. These weren't barbarians smashing through the walls. They were the people who've been living there for generations who basically decided they didn't need the empire anymore. And then I'll just share this final quote with you. Well, if that's a historically inaccurate picture of the fall of the Roman Empire, why do we have this memory? Why did the Romans even seem so interested in presenting the empire as being in crisis along its frontiers? And as Brown says, the Roman emperor, military and civilian populations alike, needed the barbarian threat to justify their own existence. The threat of invasion justified higher rates of taxation. It gave a raison d'etre to a powerful and well-paid military class. Above all, it enabled the emperor to stand tall as the defender of civilization. And you can think about that, and I'll just stop right there, actually, if that sounds familiar to you. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, now we jump easily 1,500 years, maybe 2,000 years into the Cold War, and I will have a slide change pace, namely FedEx video on the rise and fall of the Berlin Wall, and we will run this, and then when we get done with the video, I can add a few comments, and then we can have more presentation.
I should add that Dr. Jarosz wrote this script for this video, and this is all his words that we're going to see on this TEDx talk.
Yeah, and it's probably the most widely spread thing I will ever do in my life, because it's already got 3,500,000 viewers.
There we go.
In the early hours of August 13th, 1961, East German construction workers, flanked by soldiers and police, began tearing up streets and erecting barriers throughout the city of Berlin and its surroundings. This night marked the beginning of one of history's most infamous dividing lines, the Berlin Wall. Construction on the wall continued for the next decade as it cut through neighborhoods, separated families, and divided not just Germany, but the world. To understand how we got to this point, we have to go back to World War II. America, Britain, and France joined forces with the Soviet Union against the Axis powers. After they defeated Nazi Germany, each of the victorious nations occupied part of the country. The division was meant to be temporary, but the former allies found themselves at odds over their visions for post-war Europe. While Western powers promoted liberal market economies, the Soviet Union sought to surround itself with obedient communist nations, including a weakened Germany. As their relations deteriorated, the Federal Republic of Germany was formed in the West, while the Soviets established the German Democratic Republic in the East. The Soviet satellite countries restricted Western trade and movement, so a virtually impassable border formed. It became known as the Iron Curtain. In the former German capital of Berlin, things were particularly complicated. Although the city lay fully within the East German territory of the GDR, the post-war agreement gave the Allies joint administration. So America, Britain, and France created a democratic enclave in Berlin's western districts. While East Germans were officially banned from leaving the country, in Berlin it was simply a matter of walking or riding a subway, streetcar, or bus to the western half, then traveling on to West Germany or beyond. This open border posed a problem for the East German leadership. They had staked a claim to represent the communist resistance against Hitler and portrayed Western Germany as a continuation of the Nazi regime. While the US and its allies poured money into West Germany's reconstruction, the Soviet Union extracted resources from the East as war reparations, making its planned economy even less competitive. Life in East Germany passed under the watchful eye of the Stasi, the secret police whose wiretaps and informants monitored citizens for any hint of disloyalty. While there was free healthcare and education in the East, the West boasted higher salaries, more consumer goods, and greater personal freedom. By 1961, about 3.5 million people, nearly 20% of the East German population, had left, including many young professionals. To prevent further losses, East Germany decided to close the border, and that's where the Berlin Wall came in. Extending for 43 kilometers through Berlin and a further 112 through East Germany, the initial barrier consisted of barbed wire and mesh fencing. Some Berliners escaped by jumping over the wire or leaping from windows, but as the wall expanded, this became more difficult. By 1965, 106 kilometers of 3.6-meter-high concrete barricades had been added, topped with a smooth pipe to prevent climbing. Over the coming years, the barrier was strengthened with spike strips, guard dogs, and even landmines, along with 302 watchtowers and 20 bunkers. A parallel fence in the rear set off a 100-meter area called the Death Strip. There, all buildings were demolished and the ground covered with sand to provide a clear line of sight for the hundreds of guards ordered to shoot anyone attempting to cross. Nevertheless, nearly 5,000 people in total managed to flee East Germany between 1961 and 1989. Some were diplomats or athletes who defected while abroad, but others were ordinary citizens who dug tunnels, swam across canals, flew hot air balloons, or even crashed a stolen tank through the wall. Yet the risk was great. Over 138 people died while attempting escape, some shot in full view of West Germans powerless to help them. The wall stabilized East Germany's economy by preventing its workforce from leaving, but tarnished its reputation, becoming a global symbol of communist repression. As part of reconciliation with the East, the Basic Treaty of 1972 recognized East Germany pragmatically, while West Germany retained its hope for eventual reunification. Although the Eastern regime gradually allowed family visits, it tried to discourage people from exercising these rights with an arduous bureaucratic process and high fees. Nonetheless, it was still overwhelmed by applications. By the end of the 1980s, the liberalization of other Eastern Bloc regimes caused mass demonstrations for free travel and demands for democracy. On the evening of November 9, 1989, East Germany tried to diffuse tension by making travel permits easier to obtain. But the announcement brought thousands of East Berliners to the border crossing points in the wall, forcing the surprised guards to open the gates immediately. Rejoicing crowds poured into West Berlin as people from both sides danced atop the wall, and others began to demolish it with whatever tools they could find. Although the border guards initially tried to maintain order, it was soon clear that the years of division were at an end. After 4 decades, Germany was officially reunified in October 1990, and the Soviet Union fell soon after. Today, parts of the wall still stand as a reminder that any barriers we put up to impede freedom, we can also break down. TED-Ed is a nonprofit. If you value our work, please consider supporting it on patreon.com/TEDEd.
Okay, I hope this was a change of pace and that you were able to get at least some of the background material. Let me just make 2 or 3 statements beyond that. Clearly, we talked about the Cold War and the border, which creates the Iron Curtain, so-called by Winston Churchill in Fulton, Missouri. Berlin was a 4-power island in the Soviet zone because it was the former capital, and as long as there was no peace treaty after 1945, it was important for all the victorious powers to have a chunk of Berlin. The wall was built, as the little film shows, to stop the population drain, and it is therefore the outlier of all the walls we're going to talk about. This is the wall to keep people in, rather than people keep subversives out. And it worked for a while fairly well. 5,000 people got out, 138 got killed. But by the summer of 1989, the allies of East Germany were no longer willing to help. In Hungary, the border was opened. In Prague, the embassy was occupied, there was a panic and so on. And then there were protests all over East Germany for a right of free travel. For Americans, it's not a human right because it's kind of self-evident, except if you're illegal, you don't have a passport and you try to get into the United States, then it's much more complicated. As the little clip shows, it was a mistaken announcement by the press speaker and head of the Berlin district, Schabowski, that when he was asked when the new travel regulations would come into force, said he was looking for the piece of paper, he couldn't really read it, and then he just ad-libbed and said, well, I think immediately. Okay, and this was on worldwide television. Tom Brokaw of NBC News was in Berlin at the same time. In the evening news, it was broadcast everywhere. And that then led to the population, that is tens of thousands of people, to rush to the border crossing points that had been locked. And then there, a very important decision happened. The guards decided they wanted to survive. Okay, let that one sink in a little bit, because what do you do if you have 47 people at the Bornholmer Straße and they have submachine guns and you have 10,000 people pushing on the gate? This would have been a kind of Chinese solution. I don't want to offend my colleague here, but earlier that summer, the student rebellion had been put down at Tiananmen Square, and the East German border guards and eventually the leadership, including also Russia's Gorbachev, decided that they did not want to be bad guys. They wanted to be good guys, and therefore they were not going to use force. And it could have been stopped only with force. For a long time it worked. For almost 3 decades it worked. And of course, the joyful celebration of Easterners and Westerners meeting, giving each other flowers, hugging, giving them champagne, and so on, sort of decreased the fear that if the Germans got back together again, there would be World War III. That was really, what people in Holland were worried about, in Israel. Maggie Thatcher in Britain was still in World War II with her head and didn't like it either, but Gorbachev had no plan B. There was no alternative, and self-determination was a very strong kind of appeal. And once the wall falls, then the debate shifts from reforming East Germany to German reunification, and that's what then ends up happening. And today, there is a wall memorial at the Bernauer Straße. There is internet access to a wall kind of city-sponsored video. And there are plans for a Cold War museum at Checkpoint Charlie. And I am the honorary head of the committee that is trying to get this Cold War museum established. Thank you.
So I feel like for everybody else, it's been history, and this is contemporary, even though I'm a historian. I wanted to thank Michelle. Trying to get 5 historians together on one panel is worse than herding cats, and she spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. So I wanted to thank you. The West Bank Wall is only one of the walls that the State of Israel has been in the process of constructing. The different walls have different purposes, and the purpose of this wall is still very much in dispute among Israelis. It's called the West Bank Barrier by the Israelis. Most of the rest of the world calls it a wall. Part of it is barrier, and you can see sort of a cross section there on the left of the places in rural areas where it's actually comprised of fencing and moats and roads that divide the fencing, and it's a very elaborate complex. What you see on the right is the urban wall. Professor Yarash talked about the Berlin Wall being 3.2 meters tall. This one is 8. meters tall. And you can have a sense of just how much this impedes the urban landscape when you realize that this is a human. This little character here, that's a person. That's how big the wall looks. That's how much space it will take up in an urban environment. There are 6 barriers right now in Israel. Israel seems to be trying to wall or fence itself in. The one that people keep talking about as being potentially a model for the American southern border wall is this one, the one with Egypt that goes along with Sinai. It was built between 2010 and 2013 for $450 million, and it runs 150 miles. This was a wall similar in its intent to the wall that our current president is talking about. There were lots and lots of immigrants and asylum seekers from Africa coming into Israel, which has a very vibrant economy. Between 2006 and 2012, some 40,000 Africans arrived in Israel, 70% of them from Eritrea, 20% of them from Sudan. After the wall was completed, there have been no illegal crossers. So this is a combination of fencing, but largely it's electronic surveillance. There's also a wall with Israel, between Israel and Lebanon, and a wall with Syria, and a very small wall. Now, despite all of these walls, an estimated, according to the Israeli government, 50,000 Palestinian workers work illegally every day in Israel. So they're largely from the West Bank. There are lots of stories about them that you can find on the internet. They sleep in fields, they sleep in warehouses, they sleep in empty buildings. They're terrified of of being arrested, though many of them have served multiple times in jail, and they still keep circumventing the walls or going under the walls and fences because there's no work in the occupied territories on the West Bank and Gaza. And so they keep coming in because the alternative, as they'll explain, is starvation. If you've got children and you need food, then you do what you have to work. And sometimes what you have to do is circumvent a wall. So there are many different barriers. This is a very complicated image of the Israeli West Bank barrier. Let's see. Does that help? What you probably can't see is that the red line is the line where the barrier is going to be constructed or is currently constructed. The green line is the area that used to be part of the armistice lines in 1949 that the international community considers Israel's own territory. This wall is going to be wall and fencing that you saw from the first slide. It's going to be some 670 kilometers long. 85% of it cuts into territory that Israel took in 1967, which the world community does not consider Israel's by legal. It was built between 2000 and 2003. That's when most of it was built. It's not completely completed yet. And the reason was that there was the beginning of a second uprising among the Palestinians. And though that was initially a nonviolent uprising, by 2002, it had become quite violent. In the first 3 years of the uprising, there were 70 suicide bombings where Palestinians had come in from the West Bank, killing more than 300 Israelis. In the next 3 years, there were only 12. The Israelis claim that they need this wall for security purposes. It's enormous. And so for Israel, this has largely been successful in terms of keeping people who would commit terrorist acts out of the country. On the other hand, it has many other impacts, which are devastating for the Palestinian population. For one thing, in so many areas, there's a space between the official green line and the new wall. Those areas are called the seam zone. In these areas, the people who own the land between the wall and the 1949 boundary, the green line, are forced to get permits in order to go tend their crops, to go to their wells. There's a terrific film about one of these conflicts in the town of Bilin, where it talks about, was it 8 broken cameras? They're repeatedly Palestinians living in this town try to go to the other side of the separation barrier in order to till their fields, in order to get to the well, in order to get to medical attention. And they are dependent on Israeli soldiers opening the wall for them. And that's dependent on permits. And Israel has been very reticent to provide permits. The walls and what you see in the blue, these are permanent, continuously staffed border crossings. The red are continually staffed internal crossings. Every time Palestinians want to take goods to market, want to go to their jobs, need to access schools, they're required as part of the protection for Israelis. The Palestinians are required to go through all of these barriers and checkpoints. It's divided families from each other, so there'll be one in one part that's behind one part of the wall, and another part of the family that's in another part of the occupied territories. The construction of the wall took a lot of very arable, productive land away from the people who had owned it. And the construction of the wall used a lot of water, which is in short supply in this whole region, and has contaminated some of the wells. People are no longer able to get to a lot of their wells and are forced to buy water very expensively from Israel. Because most of this is not being built on Israeli territory, it's being built, most of the other walls that we've talked about have been built by people on their own territory. Much of this has been built on territory that the international community considers to be occupied, and therefore the Israelis can't construct permanent things on it. The International Court of Justice has declared it illegal in all of the times that 85% of the space where it crosses into occupied territory. Israel's right wing doesn't like this border in so many ways. It's really interesting. So the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who seems to be about to become the new prime minister after the elections that took place yesterday, has promised to annex Israeli settlements. Many of those settlements are on the other side of this boundary. It's very difficult to come up with a contiguous state if Israelis can get back and forth across the boundary much more easily, and there are roads that are built just for Jewish Israelis to use, and Palestinians aren't allowed to use them. But the right wing nonetheless fears that this wall will create a definitive eastern border for the state of Israel. The international community decided on borders in 1947, when the promise was to create a two-state solution. So the Jewish state was in this blue color, a Palestinian state is in the yellow color, and the Jerusalem international zone is in pink. So that's an international decision, a very non-viable set of borders. The map here, the 1949 Rhodes Armistice line, is what we think of as the green line. This is the only internationally recognized border for Israel, but Israel never accepted these lines as a border. It was the armistice lines. It never became official borders. Israel has never declared its own borders. In 1967, Israel, in a war that lasted 6 days, took the Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan. The United States has just recognized the Golan as being Israel's. Gaza is a very complicated legal situation. Sinai went to Egypt. So one of the things that the right in Israel worries about is that without that if the border wall continues, it defines an eastern border that Israelis are unwilling to define. I'm at 10 minutes, but my last slide. What I want, since I'm teaching a course on water in the fall, and I'm fascinated by issues of water, one of the things that I wanted you to know that is that this wall also defines where most of Israel's water comes from. This is a very arid area, and what you see with all those the dots, the blue dots, and the arrows, this is where the aquifer is, along on the west, underneath the West Bank, and along the coast, Gaza. So the occupied territories are extremely important for Israel if Israel's going to maintain water. The wall, so is really a complex issue. If Israel continues to box itself in, it's defining its borders in ways that it has never been willing to do before. Israel considers this extreme essential for its security, but it's been devastating for the Palestinians that have been divided from their lands and their water sources.
Good afternoon. While we're getting our last PowerPoint ready, thank you all very much for coming. It's really an honor to join my colleagues this afternoon, and I also thank Professor King for organizing our panel and for bringing all of us together. In the context of heightened political rhetoric around borders, walls, and immigrants, let us think of walls in the context of borderlands as spaces that are shaped by diverse peoples who dwell in them or pass through them, establishing new identities and social formations over time. With this perspective, we can understand better the border conflict that we witness and the acrimonious debates over rising barriers of steel, stone, and electronic surveillance along the US border with Mexico. Many innovative thinkers from different world regions have made borderlands a dynamic field that embraces economic circuits of production and exchange, ecological biomes, social and familial networks, international security, and social, linguistic, and cultural frontiers. I shall explain my own commitment to borderlands and why I find it such an exciting field of study, before returning to the problem of borders as we experience it so keenly in our own lives and in the turbulent borderlands we witness around the world. We can then bring our thoughts to questions of migration, immigration, displacement, and belonging that concern us in the conundrum of border walls and migratory cycles. My commitment to borderlands is deeply personal and an integral part of my professional formation. Having lived 2 decades in northwestern Mexico, my perception of the greater Sonoran Desert as a transitional space culturally and ecologically sharpened my awareness of borderlands that transcends the border between Mexico and the United States. While living and working there, I learned that living in the borderlands means embracing linguistic transitions, becoming attuned to gradual changes in climate and vegetation, and appreciating the chronological depth and spatial breadth of migratory patterns that describe the formation of communities and become ingrained in the everyday routines of extended families. In my research, I asked how indigenous peoples endured in a colonial frontier that was marked by aridity and degrees of nomadism, that was linked to the core institutions and economic circuits of New Spain and the early formative Mexican Republic. These questions remain relevant for Oram, Yaqui, Tarahumara, Jumano, and other indigenous groups who today live in Baja California, Sonora, Chihuahua, Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico, in mobile communities that cross the international boundary, but retain deep historical roots in both the United States and Mexico. Keeping in mind this historical framework for borderlands, let us turn to the issues we face with creating and resisting borders in our own time as citizens and members of local communities. The photograph we see here conveys sharply the visual and material violence caused by the U.S. border fences in the millennial landscape of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts, extending into the Pacific Ocean. Built over 3 decades and 4 United States presidential administrations, portions of walls, fences, and virtual walls of sensors and cameras cover 1/3 of the 2,000-mile border between Mexico and the United States. These barriers separate modern communities like Tijuana and San Isidro and tear apart the fabric of familial and social networks whose livelihood is grounded in the existence of the border and the economies it generates. These fences and the walls so loudly demanded by President Trump cannot but remind us of the walls that have turned Palestine into an archipelago of communities in a war-torn arid land half a world away, as Professor Shields has just told us. Small-scale borders signify property demarcations and territorial enclosures. As shown here, agave stands and ocotillo living fences planted around household gardens and stone walls mark family or community boundaries in small-scale peasant economies. Rows of cottonwoods and willows planted on the edge of floodplains support irrigation systems, and they mark use rights of both land and water. Borders then are deeply significant in scales ranging from the intimate and communal to regional and international spheres. Borderlands are physical spaces experienced in their material reality and changing contours. They become cultural spaces understood as social networks that do not necessarily constitute bounded territories. These networks trace meaningful linkages among peoples, commodities, migratory pathways, and historical memories across distances and political barriers. As we're reminded daily, the U.S. southern border encompasses migratory routes from Central America that flow through Mexico. Let us consider for a moment their historical depth from the ancient past to recent history. Northern Honduras formed part of the chain of Mesoamerican city-states with agricultural technology and monumental architecture, symbolized by the urban complexes of Copan in Honduras, Tikal in Guatemala, and Palenque in Mexico. These classic Mayan centers paralleled the rise of city-states like Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico, with a succession of tributary polities culminating in the 15th century imperial power of the Mexicas. So when the Romans were falling into crisis in the 3rd century, these great monumental centers of Mesoamerica were rising to their splendor. The Mexicas, sometimes known as the Aztecs, would confront the Iberian invaders and rework their own political ambitions into the new colonial order beginning in the 16th century. Outside the monumental city-states, millions of small-scale peasant farmers, hunters, and gatherers shaped the tropical highlands and coastal marshlands of Mexico and Central America, as well as the arid lands of present-day Mexico and southwestern United States. The blending of European and indigenous cultures created new formations and ethnic identities, together with the Africans and Asians who came to the Americas and specifically to Mexico, and brought with them seeds, animals, and knowledge of planting and grazing that further enriched and complicated the social and cultural matrix of Latin America. Borderland ecologies, then, are closely entwined with the mutual production of landscapes and peoples. The emergence of new peoples and new kinds of people has occurred multiple times through colonial encounters, territorial disputes, and forced migrations, as well as the deeper histories of convivencia, and commingling throughout the Americas, a process that may have happened in a similar way on the boundaries of the Roman Empire or along those broken walls of China. Mobility across continents and oceans in our own age requires new political and ethical solutions to the problems of national boundaries and ethnic divisions. Recent history shows us how the peoples and economies of the United States, Mexico, and Central America are inextricably entwined. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Mexico and Central America, rural land and privatization proceeded at unprecedented rates, often through violence, turning food cropland into tropical estates for export commodities like sugar, coffee, bananas, and henequen. Peasant farmers became dependent peons and day laborers, often forced to migrate to marginal lands or across long distances to seek work, even crossing international boundaries. Migratory patterns from Mexico and Central America to the United States seem to us to have reached unprecedented dimensions over the last 3 decades, but their origins lie in these histories of transnational agribusiness in the tropics and the precarious conditions of dependent laborers who were uprooted from the land. 4 developments highlight the displacement and impoverishment of rural workers and peoples. For Mexico, the Bracero program of 1943 to 1964, tied to the demand for agricultural labor in the United States, was followed by the industrial assembly plants that surround all Mexican border cities, beginning in the 1960s and continuing to the present day. The growth of these factories has transformed the landscapes of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts, turning border cities into swollen urban centers surrounded by shanty towns with poor levels of hygiene and sewage removal and highly toxic environments. A large percentage of this labor force are women, making clothing, electronics, medical equipment, auto parts, and plastics. Assembly plant workers have begun to organize to demand better working conditions and hours, childcare, and safe transportation, as well as higher wages. The Bracero program gave Mexican workers legal entry into the United States, and over its 22-year span, it brought some 4.5 million workers to the United States, but under highly exploitative and dehumanizing conditions. It was terminated partly because of these protests. Even so, the demand in the United States for farm labor reopened institutional conduits for agricultural workers coming from Mexico, leading to the current H-2A program, bringing tens of thousands of farm workers to North Carolina. Painful histories of dictatorship, civil war, and genocide have lacerated the peoples of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. These decade-long conflicts, abetted by the United States support for right-wing paramilitary troops, were brought to fragile negotiated peace accords at the close of the 20th century. But new cycles of violence emerged from those wars, linked to the drug trade and juvenile gangs, which fuel the northward migrations of men, women, and children through Mexico to the United States border. Underlying the dramatic stories of extortion, kidnapping, and murder that have turned migrants into refugees, the 2 major international trade agreements, NAFTA and CAFTA, have worsened social and economic inequalities in the region. They benefit middle and upper class consumers. They give financial incentives to large-scale import-export businesses, but they have impoverished further the countryside, placing insurmountable barriers for credit and market access to small-scale peasants who are hard-pressed to compete with transnational conglomerates and the kinds of subsidies that the United States government continues to pay to American farmers. So like the Palestinians who bridged the wall to feed their families, this is why Central Americans continue to come. In closing, let's turn to the question of border walls. Legal scholar Wendy Brown and journalist Atosa Araxia Abrahamian have argued that efforts to erect walls at the US-Mexico border in Israel and in Europe reflect not strengthened nation states, but an eroded sense of national sovereignty and fears of insecurity in the face of expanding networks of globalization and migration. Territorially bounded nation states are giving way to an international arena of transnational workers with economic, affective, and spiritual ties that cross multiple national borders. Thank you.
So we are now going to have the remaining time for questions. So I'll sort of just pick and choose, and you can ask questions of individual panelists or of all the panelists. I'm going to open the floor to all of you.
Why was the Egyptian border successful at barring undocumented Africans while the undocumented Palestinians are still able to get in?
Well, the undocumented Palestinians were
Still able to get through to work in Israel.
I can't answer that. There was a very brief time that there was a massive influx during the Civil War in Eritrea, where Africans were coming in from Egypt. But they didn't have the kinds of networks that Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza had to get into and find places to stay and find labor in 1940, pre-67 Israel.
What sort of work are they? What sort of work are they doing?
Agricultural and construction workers. And that had been the case before the wall, before the border wall, before the second Intifada. A lot of the same things that Americans hire Spanish-speaking workers for were being done by Palestinians. And as soon as the 2000 Intifada began, the Israelis started refusing them access to their previous jobs. So they had been working. This was a new division.
Any other questions?
Sure.
Can I ask a question? Of course. So I really love listening to my colleagues talk about how there are hybrid zones of contact. And I love the idea of joining places in ambiguous spaces. And one of the big problems, as Cynthia pointed out, was that walls define space in a way that's very environmentally destructive. But they also define space in a way that creates cultural homogeneity, which seems to me to be essential for a nation state. Which is one of the problems with the kind of nationalism that we're dealing with. So I wanted to know from my colleagues or the people who listen to all of us about this. I mean, I've always seen this hybridity as really important and very, I mean, that's why we're all trying to do this diversity stuff, because hybridity, but the connection of ideas and people have been the way that populations have really flourished. And the Israeli border wall seems to be the result of a nationalist effort, like the American border wall, to homogenize, to create a population that's one thing.
Well, I've noticed in core areas, I'm thinking of Paris, France, where the language exchange really rapidly. Outlying areas where I was taught in the 70s, 60s school, and to the ancient areas back in earlier provinces in Canada, where whole nations essentially. So what's the implication for national homogeneity? The question that Paris is emblematically French, and it changes rapidly. So I think there's also an urban-rural divide, so that the vaunted nationalism are really least comfortable with national scale unity, which the kernel is in identity. kernel of no national strength captures the nation around.
In the recent European past, there is a kind of nostalgia for multi-ethnic living together, especially in Central Europe, Slavic populations, German speakers, and so on. But the 20th century with ethnic cleansing, genocide, and so on, has really radically implemented kind of self-determination and territoriality, nation-state homogenizing project, which has had terrible consequences. It started as a liberal kind of hope for better living together, and then it tipped.
Well, I wonder if that's being fed by very narrow, I'll call them collective autocrat groups like Code Network in particular, or self-appointed, or other, I'll call them war type takes that are influenced by, with intention for instability. I heard a Brexiteer say that if they're allowed to vote in the elections, they will vote to infuse chaos into the European Parliament. I just heard that this morning.
Sure, well, I mean, if there's a liberal commitment to diversity and hybridity and living together, and so on, it's very much under attack right now. I think there are fears of, among ordinary people that are then exploited by populists. And I think the populists are not inventing this, they are using.
We've heard recently that that certain elements are trying to keep certain populations at the brink of collapse. I've said enough.
Are there any questions for the students?
Yeah, actually, yeah, I was going to respond to what Sarah said, but why don't we open? I'm curious. I know I have some students here. Don't ask a question from me though. Ask one from my colleagues. Come on, History 107.
You mentioned China building a new kind of wall. Can you go into more detail about that?
So when I say build a wall, I'm referring to the Great Firewall of China. But that's what it's called, and it was named that not by the Chinese, although they use now the GFW as their moniker for it. It's not an actual wall. It's basically a name for laws and technological devices and software the Chinese government uses to keep its citizens from having access to what you know as the internet, right? So China has a very robust, I had some slides I didn't get a chance to show you, very robust, everything that you have on the internet, Chinese people have too, but they have their own version of it. So, like instead of Amazon, they have Alibaba. Instead of Facebook, they have WeChat. Instead of, YouTube, they have Youku. They have everything you have, but they have a Chinese version, which is therefore subject to censorship. So the firewall is something that basically people who are in China, for example, a lot of foreign students or foreign businesses who want access to their Gmail, to their Facebook, to their whatever, they use something called VPN, which allows them to kind of, I don't know if you are familiar with that, basically if you pretend to be dialing from the United States, so then you can have access to all the internet sites that the United States has. So recently what's been happening with the Great Firewall is that the government is trying to crack down on VPN access as well. So it used to be that educated people, students, people with some means had a not that difficult time to get around the firewall. But you have to be savvy enough to know how, to use software to do so. Now China is even cracking down on VPN software and basically putting people in jail who kind of put sites out or software that allows you to tunnel under, quote unquote, the Great Firewall. So they want everyone who is going to use a VPN in China to use officially sanctioned VPN software, which the Chinese government then has censorship control over. So what's really amazing to me is that China pioneered wall technology, and now they're going to pioneer firewall technology, basically to allow its citizens to see only really what they care to see. And quite frankly, most people are okay with it. You know, you get their cat videos, they're fine with it. They don't need to know about all this other stuff, you know, that's floating out there. And so if you're in China and you look up something like, you know, Tiananmen Square, June 4th or something like that, you just won't get the results that you would get here. You just get error, page not found, or, you know, so many sensitive words now they can just basically censor, you know, Taiwan, Tibet, any kind of flashpoint words, texts or whatever. They have very sophisticated ways of just not letting you see those things.
So it's like isolationist, like power students, like.
Oh, I don't think it's isolationist at all. I think this is China exporting itself to the world. What we're not going to see is China hiding behind this so-called Great Firewall. China will export its vision of the future to the rest of the world. It's a very different kind of mindset. I don't think China is by no means isolationist today. It's simply exporting its vision of modernity to the rest of the world. Yeah.
I would say like the professors say the Berlin Wall, the story of Berlin Wall remind me of the current situation in China and China mainland between the Hong Kong and Taiwan is like we have that kind of like much more invisible Berlin Wall today, but why I say it's very similar to Berlin Wall because we are like the same nation, we have same root in China, just like Western and East German. So if someone is living in like Hong Kong or Shenzhen, they can like pass every day. Someone living in Hong Kong can go to Shenzhen for school. Someone living in Shenzhen can go to Hong Kong for work. It's very convenient, and you can like pass the Great Firewall as well once you get to the Hong Kong. And it's very interesting for me to see like kind of boundary. The border is coming more complicated than ever in history. Like the border is both visible and invisible, is both inconvenient and convenient. And my hometown is like is at the closest point to Taiwan. So a lot of my ancestors, they can swim to Taiwan in history, they did. And most often they will able to do so. And often like when is called like the white terror era in Taiwan, like they get shot by Taiwan's government soldiers. But now like you can very easily go to Taiwan once you got a special kind of passport. In China, you can go to Taiwan in any time, and it's very good. You don't have to go through like kind of a border or like once you get to like US, you have a lot of check. You don't have to go to all of that. Just get in some airplane and fly down. You are all set. So that kind of it's very complicated to say like Chinese current firewall situation is about because they allow people to just simply go outside of their firewall, but they still say that to limit kind of access. So that is very complicated.
One of the really interesting things about Chinese censorship per se is that the rules are very fluid. So one day you can access it, another day you can't, you know, and some laws are enforced and some laws aren't, and it changes a lot. So what happens is that people end up kind of, you know, if you're a journalist or whatever, you kind of censor yourself. And that's the idea, is like, because you don't know where the border is. And as you say, it's very complicated. It's both visible and invisible, and it fluctuates a lot. So uncertainty keeps people on their toes. One more thing I was thinking about that I thought I'd ask all of you was just in sitting here, I was thinking, we've been talking about walls and borders, and Brexit obviously comes to mind. You know, there's no physical border, but one of the big drivers of it was to keep people out, you know, keep Eastern Europeans out of the UK. And what is ironic is that it's a hard border with Northern Ireland and Ireland that becomes this sticking point when, you know, it was kind of this idea of we are an island nation, and oops, we forgot there's a part that there is actual, you know, if we have to put up an actual border and put up a literal wall, that causes a huge complication and perhaps a return to violence in an area that has, you know, been peaceful for some decades now. So I think that's just an interesting kind of, you know, extension of our thinking about walls and borders is Brexit.
Well, I mean, one dimension of that in the EU is the Schengen agreement, the little town at the border of Luxembourg, France, and Germany, in which then the agreement abolished border controls, within 17 countries in Europe. And of course, on the daily level, this is lovely. This is very good. But when you get into migration problems and policing problems and so on, it turns into a nightmare. And so people who don't like it, who feel insecure by it, try to get rid of it. And the British made a mistake by being too open right at the beginning in their border treatment, and the Austrians and the Germans said, let's wait 7 years before we let everybody in. And that created a transition time, and that cut down the backlash. Whereas in Britain, they were very idealistic in many ways, opened up and had tremendous influx, and then they couldn't cope with it. And so this is also a question of perception and of feeling, whether people feel insecure, whether people feel open.
Do you have a question? Yeah. So you mentioned that when the Roman walls fell, basically the empire fell with it. And I was curious, has there ever been any instances in history where like a nation or empire as successful as the United States had their success and then try to build a wall already in the success? Because I feel like it's a common theme that with a lot of these nations or empires, the wall's built, which leads to the success and then to the fall. But in our instance, we're already so successful, and now we're trying to build a wall in the middle of the success.
A retrospective wall.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be curious to hear from others on this. I'll say up front, I want to be clear, the idea that the wall fell, and maybe this is something I need to be clear about, the wall fell and the empire fell, that's the classical way of thinking about it, right? That's what you get with Gibbon, and it's really reductionistic. It's just kind of wrong and inaccurate. But you're right that those Roman frontiers are very much established in an early stage of this kind of creation of empire. It's really, I like your mention of it being like a colonial encounter. I mean, it is. And it creates a hybrid space where people are living along these frontiers. And the walls are part of that early stage of the process. And you're right about the homogeneity, Sarah, that the theory is there's Romans on one side and there's barbarians on the other. And the wall keeps them apart. And that's not the historical reality. And when you look at the ecology or archaeological evidence too, you can start to see that people are like burying themselves in the same way. People are settled on both sides. People are eating the same foods you realize these walls were there and could be meaningful at certain points in the defense of empire, but really were these hybrid zones. And when I think about the borderlands you were describing, I mean, if you've ever been to New Mexico or Arizona or Texas, you realize people speaking Spanish have been doing that on both sides of those borders for centuries, right? Eating similar foods, wearing similar clothes. I don't think I've given nearly enough thought to indigenous peoples that are inhabiting these ecological areas. And so now suddenly we're going to we need the wall. I mean, so I don't know if there is an historical analogy to this that,
It's a very interesting question, if I may speak to it. Does the wall signify success and fortitude, or does the wall signify fear and failure? But I do want to say, in the few minutes we have left, that we want to think of this in different ways. These are not horizontal east-west walls, and as Michelle said, the Great Wall of China is not really a wall. These are not horizontal lines, but rather really vertical corridors that people are making in their movements northward. And, Honduras has come to North Carolina. We are part of this border zone. We are part of this borderland. It's not just a line between Mexico and the United States. And Chicago is a part of this borderland. Los Angeles. These are where New York. I mean, it's the people who create these borderlands. And people come out of necessity, they come out of fear, and they come seeking opportunity. They come in the ways that our ancestors came. Either by ship or by land. The border between Mexico and the United States was an open border until the 1920s, when immigration laws began to be created. And as Michelle was saying, in terms of the ambiguities of the Chinese firewall today, the way those immigration laws were enforced was also inconsistent, ambiguous, and very difficult for people to navigate. The same people farmed and the same people mined copper in Arizona, in Sonora, in Texas, and in Nuevo Leon. And the same people were mine workers and farmers on both sides of the border. It was a border land, not a border. And I think that the question of heterogeneity or homogeneity of who we are and how do we identify ourselves has a lot to do with looking at the people around us and understanding that we're part of a common set of communities.
And Stephen Miller was on the radio just this morning saying, basically, you can't have national sovereignty without borders and you need walls. And so that's the view. And I've been fascinated down in El Paso. You keep seeing these local mayors who are like, where's the crisis? I don't see the crisis. People are going back and forth and working and going to school. We've been doing this for generations. Crime is actually lower than it was 10 years ago.
But it's not about the crisis in the borderland.
It's not.
It's a crisis in the mind of people who feel threatened.
Yeah,
It's not a line, just
that's exactly right.
Well, thank you all for any further questions. Thank you all very much for joining.
Yeah. I have to run to another talk.
Thank you very much, all of you.
So thanks, Michelle.